Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this series, we've been talking with Susan Mizrachi, editor of a new book published by Springer Nature called Libraries and Archives in the Digital Age. Susan is a William Arrowsmith Professor in the Humanities at Boston University. She's also director of BU's Center for the Humanities and a professor of English. This series is brought to you by Springer Nature. Susan's book is a uniquely collaborative volume. It brings together contributions from librarians, library directors, and academic scholars that explore the impact the digital era has had on the collection and maintenance of scholarly and communal output in four distinct areas: access, preservation, archival politics, and the profession. While the book provides a wealth of information on the opportunities and challenges digital technology presents for scholarly and archival content, it also shines a bright light on the areas of occupational overlap among academics, librarians, and digital professionals, revealing how important, productive, and rewarding collaboration within an institutional structure can be. In this final episode of our four-part series, Susan and I talk about how new working relationships, solidified out of necessity during the pandemic, might continue to produce fruitful results. So libraries and librarians themselves continue to evolve to meet the digital moment. Harriet Green, who you mentioned earlier, who is Associate University Librarian for Digital Scholarship and Technology Services at Washington University in St. Louis, points out that librarians have never overlooked an opportunity to diversify and expand services, spaces, and resources in the digital age. The newest opportunity, she says, is to eclipse the service orientation and become collaborators, which will embed librarians even further into the research ecosystem. Can you talk a little bit more about how Ms. Green states or sees this happening?
Yeah, well, I think this is very much related to the earlier issue we were talking about, which is the demands that our digital age put on librarians, and the way they have to navigate ever changing, sort of ever more innovative, digital platforms,
Yeah.
and they just, I mean, God only knows. I mean, I know that there are tons and tons of journals and handbooks and guidebooks, but obviously they go out of date too. But
Yeah.
this, she has an observation in her essay. She said, she talks about how a more mature digital institutional culture is one that recognizes that digital work is most effectively implemented through partnerships. I mean, that this is, it's related to what I was saying before too, with reference to Jack Ammerman's piece, that it's too complicated and too multidimensional, the work that our digital age has acquires us to pursue, for individuals. And we all depend increasingly on partnerships. On she talks about ad hoc groupings of professionals. That any project, I mean, you think it's just a scholar's project. On I think of Falu Ingam's project on Ajami literacy, it's not just his project. He has graduates, student assistants, he has programmers, he has designers, and then he has, above all, librarians, working, to construct search tools and, design the project, to multiply and enable, wider access, and it's, there has to be a kind of recognition, institutionally again. I think that's, her big point of the increasing complexity of the digital environment and the way that requires so many hands. And I think it's also, she also talks too. I mentioned the idea of libraries as increasing librarians as increasingly engaged in pedagogical activities, but I think the pace of change and innovation, in our digital environment just requires librarians, to be, increasingly good at this. And in fact, this is something I've really, really noticed in the past 5 years. And again, the pandemic has put a kind of stop on a lot of these developments. But, many more workshops, for university faculty and students run by librarians
Mm-hmm.
to help, faculty and students learn about,
Yep.
these new digital methods. And, so again, they're, and actually, we have, integrated, librarians into our fellow seminars. I mean, every fellow seminar, starts with a visit from the librarian, and a few people from the library to talk about resources and digital resources and ways that they can assist research. So, I think that's these are all sort of part of this recognition that Harriet Green is talking about.
Right, right. So speaking of the pandemic, we'll hopefully be emerging from this nightmare this spring, or somewhere thereabouts. In some of our recent Authority File episodes and series, we've been asking our guests how they think certain practices necessitated by remote working and learning might actually end up sticking around long term.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to get your take on that too. I guess somewhat hypothetically, what are some of the ways the pandemic has accelerated our digital environment in higher education?
Yeah, well, it's just, as I mentioned before. I mean, I think anyone who is fortunate enough, to just have the accident, and it's, I guess accident isn't the word, but it does feel at times that it's, somewhat unpredictable what, resources, what archives are going to be digitized and what aren't, and
Mm,
they're waiting. I mean, there are all kinds of explanations, for why some have and some haven't. But I do think that it is certainly just massively, accelerated and enabled research that is that's had the good fortune, to be, to rely on digital resources and digital sort of availability. I mean, I guess what I would also say is, I think it's possible. I mean, we certainly have noticed. I mean, on the one hand, Zoom and the fact that we're all spending so much time on it these days, and meeting, in this fashion, you could argue we're zoomed out, a lot of us,
yeah.
and kind of just surfeited, by all these meetings. But I do think there are ways in which it enables collaboration and allows people to communicate with each other and share ideas in ways that that were just more challenging before.
Hmm.
And I do think, I think the biggest problem with university life, and this is something I don't know if we've really talked about it directly yet, but I think that it's, we all inhabit our silos, the silos that, our disciplines create, our departments, our, institutions more generally. And I think we're rewarded, as academics and as, staff, and I think this is as true of, staff as it is of faculty, that we're rewarded for specializing, and we're rewarded for tending our own gardens. And, the more adept we get at, doing this, the more narrow our horizons. But I think that one consequence of, the pandemic and the pervasiveness of Zoom, may be that it's easier for us to reach out because we
Yeah.
don't have to go anywhere. We just, get on Zoom. We just send an email and we ask someone, in a different area, if they want to, talk to us about X. And there's a greater chance potentially of the kinds of exchanges that, that we've been talking about throughout this conversation happening potentially. So I do wonder to some extent whether that might not be a kind of silver lining in the cloud of the pandemic, that people learn to collaborate more just because they're prevented, in a way, they're deprived of the sort of conventional and regular office and academic, or institutional exchanges that they live on, that typically nourish them. And maybe outreach, will be a positive consequence of that. I'm not sure, but, I think collaboration is the name, of the game. I think it's the thing that we all have to do. And maybe bridge building, is more possible when we're all just frozen in place.
Ironically, yeah. I think that's true. I think a lot of what's happened in the last year or so is like there's been a lot of collaboration almost out of necessity in certain respects, and particularly as institutions have had to develop new ways to continue instruction and train faculty and students, and libraries have had a huge role in that. And hopefully that sort of collaboration of necessity will continue even when it's not necessary. That sort of inspires a continued sort of partnership among different departments. Well, Susan, that's all the time we have. I mean, I want to thank you very much for being on the program.
Thank you. This has been great, and I really appreciate the opportunity, to talk with you about these issues. So, thanks very much.
Sure thing. You just heard from Susan Mizrachi, who edited Libraries and Archives in the Digital Age. Susan is a William Arrowsmith Professor in the Humanities at Boston University. She's also director of BU's Center for the Humanities and a professor of English. This series is brought to you by Springer Nature. If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced by Choice's senior digital media producer, Mark Dirks, and digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.